You'd be irate too, Department.
Imagine playing 60 minutes, 3,600 seconds on a cold, snowy, muddy, Arctic blast swept field, knocking cabezas, tackling, maiming, wounding, mutilating, disfiguring other human beings as well as yourself. And as you scrape off the mud, wipe the sweat, soak up the blood, and you assess your missing body parts, you realize that, despite all the carnage and sacrifice, the game ended in a tie. How would you feel? Hi everyone, this is Will O'Toole, welcoming you to another edition of Park Ridge Sports History, and again, a wish for a happy Thanksgiving weekend. I hope everyone has been enjoying not just Turkey Day, but everything after it, because as I said last week when I was doing the Detroit Lions show, the week before Thanksgiving has got to be one of the best weeks of the year, because it really does prepare us not only for a great national holiday in Thanksgiving, but the up-and-coming Festival of Lights, Hanukkah, Christmas, New Year's, and everything about those 6 weeks of just really a lot of bustle, a lot of hustle, a lot of mistletoe, a lot of Christmas trees, a lot of celebrations, and a real lot of fun, particularly even with sports, as college football really makes its way to the bowl season. And this year it's going to be an exciting college football playoffs prior to the bowl season. And we're going to see how that really maps out next week. And I'll probably do a show on that. College basketball really starting to gain steam, as well as the NBA and the NHL, and of course pro football making its way towards the playoffs, but the NBA and the NHL going deeper into their seasons, as well as the Hot Stove League, probably the best season, as I mentioned in a previous episode, of baseball, where you have the hirings and the firings, the trades, the free agent signings, and everything in between. So it really makes for a fantastic 6 weeks, from the week prior to Thanksgiving to the few days after New Year's. Just a lot of fun. And with that, I wanted to kind of bring in this. As you know, I like to do different types of topics and shows. And of course, as always, I really appreciate you allowing me into your homes and talking everything sports. And usually I do have a focus each week about where I want the show to go. As you can see, I have in the background the Cfl Playoffs between the Hamilton Tiger Cats and the Montreal Alouettes. Definitely Canadian football is one of my favorite sports, although I usually only get to see the playoffs. And it's always being played in the snow. And wouldn't you know it, this game in particular is being played in a flurry. So it's a lot of fun. It reminds me of when we were growing up, and always you romanticize about football being played in the mud and in the snow and the ice and all the rest of it. Well, that brings me to 1967. Now, why do you say I just pulled out 1967? I didn't. But as a kid, when I really started getting into football, I would say that the NFL, particularly the 1969 season, it was the 50th anniversary of the beginnings of the NFL. And I was always thinking about ties and how much I really hate ties when, as a weekend warrior, I've played many a games, and I said to myself, no matter how good or how bad we may be, I never want to play a tie, because it's just so frustrating. You just exude so much, and you exhaust yourself so much, and there's just so much sweat and blood that goes into playing even an inconsequential softball game, that you don't want it to end in a tie, that you want a winner and you want a loser. You want that defined, so you can say, if I lost, well, I got to improve. If I've won, wow, I've really accomplished something, even on some nickel dime softball league that I've participated in. But I actually love the ties in the NFL. Maybe hockey had too many of them, but in particular, the reason I picked up 1967 is that I love doing trivia. And probably the first year ever that the NFL had 4 divisions was the 1967 season. And what made it particularly interesting is that the 67 season, all 4 divisions, all started with the letter C, which of course I've used as a trivia question many times. They all began with the letter C. One still exists today, and that's the Central Division of the NFL. And those 4 members of the Central Division still exist. They are Detroit, Minnesota, Chicago, and Green Bay. The other 3 divisions were the Coastal, and that's a crazy one, the Capital, and the Century Division. Now, I'll get into the Capital and the Century in a little bit. The Coastal Division was a Pacific Coast League and a Atlantic Coast League, because you had the San Francisco 49ers and the LA Rams from the Pacific Coast playing in the Coastal Division, and the Atlanta Falcons and the Baltimore Colts from the East. And they actually formed a conference. Then you had the Coastal then you had the Century and the Capital. Now they have a little bit more history in terms of things. They kind of changed up, but in the original 67 standings, Dallas, Washington, Philadelphia, and the Saints were all in the Capital Division. And basically, I was going through some research on this. There's a great website. It's on YouTube, and they do kind of like what I do, only it's much more technologically advanced. But they were talking about how some of these the division names, and that for most of us, we just say East, West, North, South. But the NFL, knowing the NFL and their corporate image and marketing on all things, whether it be shoelaces or selling of soda or pennants or jerseys, etc. They actually, when they made up these names, Coastal, Capital, Century, and Central, they really did some headbanging up to the wee hours of the morning. But the Capital originally was supposed to be the original capitals of the United States. That's why Washington, Philly, soon to be New York, and the only exception was Dallas, were going to be in that division. And then the Century had Cleveland, New York, well, in the original one, Cleveland, New York, the Cardinals, and the Pittsburgh Steelers. What happened was the Giants moved to the Capital Division, and the Saints moved over to the Century like a year later. In fact, I want to make sure about that. I'm pretty sure it was for the 68 and 69 season. Yes, I was correct. So that's what transpired there. And the funny thing is that really, after 68, Dallas, the Giants, the Redskins, and Philadelphia pretty much stay together. That Century Division, Cleveland and Pittsburgh, moved to the AFC as part of the merger. New Orleans moves out, and the Cardinals are now stationed in Arizona. So it's kind of weird how that is the one division that really didn't stay. And of course, Baltimore moved to the AFC. Atlanta moved to one of the southern divisions in the NFL. And of course, you have San Francisco and now the LA Rams back in LA playing in the Western Division of the NFL. Anyway, that season 67, I was looking at this. Do you realize that I was also looking up this? What's the record for most ties in an NFL season? Well, in 1920, that's the actual record. They actually had 17 ties in the 1920 season. But you got to remember this. You have to really view this in context. The NFL was kind of like a league kind of adopting, adjusting, and adapting. Then they were grabbing teams from here, there, and everything else. If you played, let's say, as a weekend warrior in football, all of a sudden you're an NFL team back then. They didn't have, let's say, the TV. They didn't have the marketing. They also didn't have, let's say, the logistics of lights, of transportation like we do today. So you can understand why there were so many ties. Plus, the game was still in its infancy. Unlike baseball, which had been around by 1920 for over 50 years, the NFL really was just starting to come into formation. So, of course, you're going to go through growing pains. However, and I didn't realize this, ties were a thing of the game. And by 1974, the NFL, I guess, got smart and realized nobody likes ties. So we're going to play sudden death. But at the end of sudden death, if the two teams are tied, we can't exhaust the players. So we'll have a tie. Now, I don't like to play the ties when I'm playing, but I love the chaos that ties cause in the NFL, especially when you're trying to do winning percentages. Originally, here's what the NFL did. They just threw the ties out. So if you were 7-3-1, your winning percentage was 700. If you were 4 and 4-10, your winning, well, I shouldn't say 4-10. Yeah, your winning percentage was 286. And if you had a tie, let's just say, or 3-10-1, if you had a tie, they just discounted it. Now the tie goes half and half. So if you're 7-3-1, you go 8-3 and 7-4, add them, and then you do a little division percentage to figure out your winning percentage. But at one point, the NFL just threw the ties out. It's tremendous. But in 1970, and here's the deal. 1967, and this is why if you take a look, you'll see that both 67 and 1970 had the same amount of ties. Here's the difference. The NFL only counted NFL games. They actually had 9 ties. And in fact, I was doing a list. There was only 5 teams in the NFL in 1967 that did not play to a tie. The best record of all the teams with the ties was definitely, or the one with the best ledger for that 67 season was the Washington Redskins, who were 5 wins, 6 losses, and 3 ties. But the Cowboys were 9-5. They didn't tie anybody. And they were one. The New Orleans Saints also didn't tie anybody in 67. In fact, ready for this? In 67, here are the teams that did not tie. The Cowboys did not tie. Imagine going through a season, instead of saying the teams that did tie, the Cowboys did not tie, New Orleans did not tie, Cleveland and the Giants didn't tie. In fact, the Giants had one of their best records from about, from about 65 to probably 81 when they finished 7-7 that year. The other ones, San Francisco did not tie. They finished 7-7 as well. And that was it. Everybody else tied, with the Redskins, the high team, with 3 ties. And along with the Minnesota Vikings, who were 3-8-3. I still like Washington's 5-6-3. The Chargers in 1970 also had a similar record, 5-6-3. However, including the AFL that year, they actually had 2 ties. The AFL. You had, but not as many teams tied. Houston, the Jets, San Diego, and Boston, the Patriots, all had ties in their records. In fact, the Patriots were 3-10-1. The Chargers, 8-5-1. How about that? And they finished in 3rd place in the West and did not qualify, obviously, for the playoffs. Now, with that, I have to also let you know this. That 67 season, I love doing research, and I love watching the old NFL tapes and stuff. So I did find the 67 season in review, and they had the great Jack Whitaker narrating it. And if you're a real big football fan, you'll remember that Jack Whitaker used to narrate or had a pregame show. And I remember him having these huge tapes behind him, and he would go to the individual teams and show what they were doing the previous week and who might win in this week's matchups and all the rest of it. He had a beautiful voice. He was just a great sports announcer, Jack Whitaker was. And he did the narration on the 67 in review. So what I'd like to do, and I know I go off on tangent, so I apologize for anybody who is new to the show, all one of you. Here's what happens, and this is how I look at this show. I try not to be inaccurate. I will make mistakes. I will get maybe years wrong, or I may get the relief pitcher wrong in Game 6 of some game and all the rest of it. It is not because I'm doing it deliberately. It's just that it's something that comes out, and usually I will correct those errors somewhere along the line. But just I always imagine this. If we're sitting at a bar, having a hamburger and a couple of beers, and we're just sitting and romancing and going nostalgic about the games of yesteryear, about teams and players. And do you remember this? I may be off on players' names and all the rest of it, but and hopefully it might stir interest that you might look it up. But this 1967 season remains one of the most interesting because it does end with the ice ball between the Packers and the Cowboys, which is kind of interesting because when you think about it, the Packers win that game on a third down with 16 seconds left in the game on a quarterback sneak. I have actually argued that never would have occurred. That in today's corporate coaching business and everything corporate with the NFL, you would probably have had Bart Starr roll out or throw a pass play just in case he missed it. At least they were going to exhaust that last down. As it was, he called timeout. He comes to the sidelines, and Bart Starr relates it the best. He said, listen, I can sneak in. I know we've been running the running backs in, but they keep slipping on the ice, which actually, Coach, was caused by you with your new technology on the field. You didn't realize that when the moisture melted, it froze because you kept the tarp on top of the field instead of letting the moisture go into the atmosphere. That's a whole nother story. But anyway, Starr went to the sideline, said, Coach, I can get it in if I do a quarterback sneak. They had noticed something in the film on Jeffrey Pugh that you could stand him up and maybe sneak under. Lombardi's words were, all right, let's just do it. And you're like, let's get out of here. We can't make these fans suffer anymore. Today, what would have happened? 17, 14, 16 seconds left. They probably would have thrown a pass. If it was incomplete, they would have kicked the chip shot field goal and gone on to sudden death. So even though it was a 3rd and goal within inches of the goal line, it was still a gutty call by the Patriots and by the Packers. Pardon me. Anyway, really, when you think about it, even though the Cowboys were vanquished for the 2nd year in a row at the goal line in basically the last stages on almost basically the last play of the game, really, that was the emergence of America's team right after that. And really, the ascendancy of America's team, the Cowboys, and really that was outside the Super Bowl victory over the Packers. They would never be as great during that stretch of time. And, of course, Lombardi retires, and he goes to the Redskins in 69. And, of course, we all know he suffered from stomach cancer and passed away shortly after that in 1970. So when you think about that 67 season, it is kind of a really an epiphany for the league because now you have a new power coming in. Took the Cowboys another 2 or 3 years to win the Super Bowl, but they would become a power for the networks, not just in the league, but for the networks as well as they become America's team. Anyway, Whitaker in that 25-minute video accentuates a number of things with each different division. I'd like to do that today. And I'm going to start with this. The Capital Division, here's what he did with the Capital Division. He actually accentuated the play of the wide receivers. Now, I thought, and of course I had them here 2 seconds ago, they had 2 guys, Charlie Taylor and Danny Obramovic. They were both in the Capital Division. The players that be, and of course, the great thing about Charlie Taylor, Hall of Famer, Arizona State guy, all the rest of it. And then the other 2 guys that he talked about were Ben Hawkins and Lance Rensel. And I apologize, I was going through everything real quick. I wanted to actually keep Charlie Taylor for last because I wanted to give him a little bit more time. He's such a great, one of my favorite wide receivers. I guess if I had my favorite 5 wide receivers of all time, Charlie Taylor I loved. I love Drew Pearson. I love Fred Biletnikoff with all the goo on him. I probably loved Drew Pearson. I'm trying to think of maybe 2 others that I really liked quite a bit. Those 3 just come out of the pack. I'll think of others as I'm going on. I probably did like Lance Allworth, but I didn't see him play all that much. But here are the other 2 guys. Now, this is Lance Rensel, and this is Ben Hawkins. I'll talk about Hawkins a little bit more. I was unaware of Ben Hawkins, but he's a New Jersey guy. Interestingly enough, Hawkins and Charlie Taylor not only share the fact that they were wide receivers in the Capital Division in 1967, they both went to the same school, Arizona State. Hawkins actually played at both Weequahic and then transferred to Nutley High School, and then he went to the Arizona State and then to the NFL. I was actually looking at Hawkins. You know what? I'm going to put Hawkins up here and Lance Rensel. Hawkins was a pretty good player. And in fact, on that Eagles team that finished second, they were 6-7-1 that year. And it was probably one of the best records that they had with Ben Hawkins on their roster. And here is the thing with Hawkins. He was in his second year in the league, and he actually was a pretty good player on a crummy franchise. In '67, he actually led the league with 1,265 yards gained on 59 receptions for a 21.4 average. Now, here's the deal with him. He played 8 years, although I wouldn't include 1974 with Cleveland or 73 with Philly. Basically, he got in 6 games combined in those 2 years. He was 29-30. Probably injuries really took him down. Probably playing for a disappointing team. But anyway, Hawkins that year led all wide receivers in yards per game with 90.4, and he had 10 touchdowns. Now, after that 67 season, he wasn't as good. Basically, his stats dropped off by half. But I really attribute that to injury, to the fact that he was probably their one weapon, Hawkins, in their lineup as a receiver. And I know that Harold Jackson does come onto the roster, but I really attribute more to the fact that Hawkins didn't have great quarterbacks. He didn't really play for a great team, and that obviously his production goes down as they put probably double coverage on him. He does last 8 years, and I would say this. I said this in an earlier point. Had Hawkins played for a team on the up-and-coming in a different division, maybe if he had played on Minnesota, and we'll talk about them in a little bit, if he had played for Minnesota or maybe San Francisco or maybe Cleveland, where maybe he takes over for Paul Warfield, he probably would have had better stats. As it was, they weren't bad. I mean, actually, here's the deal. His yards per game never went under 16.8, which was the following year. So he was 17.7. Then he went up in 1970 to 20 yards a catch, 17, 17, 19. His last full year, he was at 19. So you're still getting the same production at him, just not as many pass completions or as many, quote unquote, the new term, targets aimed at him. That was Ben Hawkins from Weequahic, Nutley High School. Now, Lance Rensel, here's the amazing thing about Rensel. Rensel was, again, a pretty good wide receiver. In fact, he caught the big touchdown to give the Cowboys the lead in that ice ball, courtesy of a Dan Reeves. It was kind of a trick play. It was an option pass from Reeves, who was a former quarterback at South Carolina, passing to the former Sooner, Lance Rensel. Now, when I was growing up, Lance Rensel, number 19, was a pretty good player. And eventually, though, the Cowboys said to themselves, we got to get a little bit better. We had Hayes, we had Rensel, but there was another Lance that the Cowboys latched themselves onto by the name of Lance Allworth, who was nicknamed Bambi, who had played for the Chargers. And of course, he went to Arkansas. How interesting, how close they are. And Allworth, these are the only two Lances I've ever known who were wide receivers, who both had the same name, who both played for the same team, the Cowboys, and who both wore the same number, 19. It's incredible. I've never seen another wide receiver, and I could be wrong, I've never seen another wide receiver named Lance in the NFL, and I could be wrong. And I always thought it was kind of cool because I'm big with symbolism, with literature, and all the rest of it, that Lance Allworth played for the Chargers and then eventually would go to the Cowboys. So I just love that. Lance, Chargers, the whole 9 yards. But Allworth does play for, Lance Allworth does play on the Super Bowl team for the Cowboys, as he is kind of like what they did then. You get that old wily vet for those couple of games or those couple of plays, and you put them on your roster, and you hope that you make it to the end, which they did. So that was two of the wide receivers. Now, the other two wide receivers that Whitaker was talking about in this 67 film was, of course, Charlie Taylor and Dan Obramovic. Now, I have to be honest with you. They're not even close in terms of talent or in statistics. And, of course, Taylor is a Hall of Famer. The only shame for Taylor is that he never really played on really good teams until late in his career. But in 67 and in 66, Taylor led the league in receptions. He was an All-Pro a number of times. And his number 42 plus the uniform of the Redskins, I just always loved. I always thought they had one of the best uniforms going in the game back in the 60s, and I wish they still had them. I know that Spurrier kind of brought them back, but I just loved the Spears, and I loved that red, that maroon color. I just always thought they were great. And plus the yellow pants. It really accentuated their look. But on that roster, I just want to give you this. Here's Charlie Taylor. I know he led the league because I was doing some study of this. Charlie Taylor, Hall of Famer, 8-time Pro Bowler, 1-time All-Pro. That means you make the first team. He was the Rookie of the Year in 64. He makes the Hall of Fame for the All-60s team. I believe number 42 is probably retired by them. He gained over 9,000 yards in the NFL. Interesting thing about him, in 66, he had over 1,000 yards in receptions with a 15.5 average. Remember, Hawkins averaged 20. And in 66, that was 66. In 67, he led the league again in receptions with 70. This time he had 990. Now, he never reaches, in 2 years, he had over 2,000 yards, basically a 1,000-yard average. He never reaches those heights again. But you got to remember this. The game was a little bit different. It was more run-oriented than passing. And as I stated, those Redskin teams prior to Lombardi and then prior to George Allen coming were miserable teams. They did not have a good franchise until really Lombardi changed the whole culture, and then Allen gets them with the Over the Hill gang, and then he gets them into the Super Bowl in 72, 73 against the Miami Dolphins, and they lose that one 14-7. But he actually, here's an amazing thing. In 66, he had 12 touchdowns. He had 79 touchdowns. And every year, only 1 year, 65, did he have fewer than, he had four in 1971 at age 30, but in his second year at age 24, he had 3 touchdowns. But basically, this guy was almost averaging a touchdown every 2 games, which is pretty remarkable for a wide receiver in the 60s when you're only throwing the ball at most 30 times in the game. Charlie Taylor. And like I said, he and Hawkins both went to the same school. They played at Arizona State. Now, I will tell you this. I think this is a 64 card. Topps football cards are not as good as the Topps baseball cards. And here's Danny Obramovic. Now, good player. Probably, had he not played for the Saints, he would have been one of those guys that would have been a possession receiver that we see today. He would have been a great possession receiver for, let's say, the Patriots. And I saw him that way. Here's the deal. Many people always thought it was Obramovic who held who was the placeholder for Tom Dempsey. It was a guy by the name of Joe Scarpino, who actually was drafted by the Boston Patriots and wound up on that. I did take a look at that that kick, that 63-yard kick, because we were talking about it last week, and the fact that Alex Karras never even bothered to try to block the kick. And the thing is a long, low line drive. It actually probably went about 65, 66 yards in the air before it just dies. And even the announcer broadcasting the game cannot believe that, one, the Saints were trying this on a muddy field, a rainy field in New Orleans, in Tulane. I guess Tom Fears said, we got nothing else to lose. except another ball game. Send out Dempsey. And, of course, Dempsey, made history with that kick. And, of course, he had a club foot that he used. And he also had, missing digits on his one hand. So he had kind of like a club hand and a club foot. So he made for an interesting character, an interesting personality in the NFL in the 70s. And not a bad kicker. But he kicks the ball. It's a long line drive. You see Alex Karras, he just gives up. And the announcer said, I can't believe it. But Obramovic was on that team. I always liked Danny Obramovic because I could actually pronounce his name. I know it was more than 2 syllables long, and for some reason I was just able to pronounce it correctly. Maybe not today, but when I was a kid, I was able to pronounce it. Now we move into the Capitol. And I'm 31 minutes into this show. And what I might do is just accentuate the Capitol and maybe next week hit the other 2 divisions because I think it is pretty interesting. By the way, here's what I always love too. I'm not going to read this to you, but these were the backs of the cards. And many of you who collected the cards will know that I love actually the little drawings up there. They were quite an essay on some of these players. Plus, they had the stats. Now, people seeing these today might not appreciate this, but there are no such things as the internet and things like Sports Reference where you can look these stats up with your fingertips. And really, the guy who you could consider putting these stats together is a baseball guy by the name of Joe Reichler, who came out in '73 with the Baseball Encyclopedia, where he produced all of the stats of every player of all time and put it into a huge book. And I tell you, if you're a researcher or a historian, it was a go-to encyclopedia. It was huge because and it was heavy. It had to be like 25 pounds. And they came out with other editions. Today, you don't really need it because, like I said, you have these websites that have all these stats. But this was a big deal. And it was important because we could see their stats, and they just didn't do necessarily the stat from last year. They did their whole biography back there, their whole statistical history. And the funny thing is, you could always tell who the great players were because sometimes, and I'm just using baseball, with Aaron and Mays, they didn't even bother with a biography. They just listed all 20 years of their stats on the back because that's when you knew you made it and you were going to the Hall of Fame if they didn't have a little biography on you. But the Charlie Taylor one, I just want to say this. He's the first Redskin to be named the NFL's Rookie of the Year when he won the honor in 1964. He had 53 pass receptions that year from a running back position to set a new NFL record. He was the first rookie in the NFL to rank in the top 10 for both rushing and receiving yards since 1943. And his total of 15 TDs, 13 rushing and 12 receiving in 1966, or 3 rushing and 12 receiving in 66, set a new Redskin touchdown mark for the season. He ranked in the top 10 pass receivers in the NFL in his first 6 years. He won the pass receiving title in 66, repeated in 67. He won the MVP of the 64 Chicago All-Star Game and was voted All-Western Athletic Conference in 1963. That is a heck of a biography written on the back of a football card that kids like us would read and say, wow, pretty interesting. But it was filled with nuggets of information, things I didn't know. And, of course, he played at Arizona State, which, just a side note, Arizona State wins the 71 Fiesta Bowl, December 26th. I remember because I watched the game. Or December 28th or 29th. And they beat Nebraska, and it was a big deal. They beat them 17-14. And they had a wide receiver on that team who goes to the Green Bay Packers, and, of course, his name escapes me right now. Anyway, they beat Nebraska, and I always felt that Fiesta Bowl was the one that took the Fiesta Bowl from, let's say, a midstream or a lower level, lower tier bowl game to one of the Elite Five today. I mean, that bowl game is now over 50 years old, and it's got more. I'm telling you, it's got more importance than the Peach, which is far older, and the Sun Bowl, which are far older than the Fiesta Bowl. And I really do attribute it to that Arizona State 17-14 win over the Big Red Machine of Nebraska, which would go on the next year and win the national title, beating Notre Dame in the Orange Bowl, like 40-6. And Frank Kush was the coach. I do believe Frank Kush might have been his coach, Charlie Taylor's, and Ben Hawkins. I'd like to look at that again. Anyway, I'll get that to you next week. And I know I'm going to remember the guy's name as we move on. All right, so I'm going to go to the Century. Now, here was the division that was seen as, I'm going to probably leave, Kent Nix was going to be the savior for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Well, they finished 4-9-1 that year. Nix was from TCU. He never had as good a season as he did his rookie year. But I do like this card. I love the logo of the Steeler up there with the steelworker on the girder kicking a football. Now, I will tell you this. I love the Steeler logo on their helmet. I like the fact they only have it on one side. It makes it unique. There is a difference between this logo and that Steeler logo. Sometimes sometimes that cartoon does not equate or does not look as good on the helmet as, let's say, that Steeler logo. However, when I showed you the Lance Rensel one with the cowboy on the, with the cowboy on the back of the horse, I would love to just see them do that instead of the Lone Star helmet that they always have. You know, when they do retros, throw this one on there. That would be pretty cool. Or put it on their uniform jersey. I would buy that. I know that the Browns brought back that little gremlin, and that was prevalent in the 60s. I love that brown gremlin. And I would love, they did put it on the jersey. Maybe once, just throw it on the helmet. It would be kind of fun. But Kent Nix went to TCU. He was not the savior that the Steelers were hoping. In fact, they also drafted Terry Hanratty, who was a good player at Notre Dame, but he would not be the savior. It would take Terry Bradshaw, Mean Joe Green, and the Steel Curtain, and most importantly, Chuck Noll, to make the Pittsburgh Steelers into the franchise that they are today. And as I mentioned last week, you know, people today don't realize how bad the Steelers were when we were growing up. They were a terrible franchise. For the last, I would say since 71, maybe 72, they've been a playoff team, obviously. And they've had nothing really but success over the last 50 years. I think maybe collectively over those 50 years, maybe they have had 4 or 5 subpar seasons, but never like what they were when I was growing up, 2-12. That year in 67, they were 4-9. Here are 2 other guys. Interestingly enough, everybody on these squads was from the South. Nix was from TCU. Tarkenton was from Georgia. Frank Ryan was from Rice. And Jim Hart was from Southern Illinois. And the reason why, I always liked Jim Hart. I always thought he was kind of a classy quarterback. Probably would be much better suited in today's game. I love this card because I love that Cardinal logo. And here's the giant. If you can see it, it's a giant quarterback throwing it over Yankee Stadium. But that team, Tarkenton, of course, starts with Minnesota, has a fight with Brand Brocklin, goes to the Giants, and then is traded for Bob Grimm and goes back to the Vikings. Fortunate for him. Terrible for the Giants because with Tarkenton, they basically had a couple of chances. Without him, they were really just a mediocre franchise until they just change everything. Get Parcells in there and Ray Perkins, and, Lawrence Taylor, Phil Simms, etc., and they become, the blue wall defense, and they have much success in the 80s, winning a couple of Super Bowls, and then with Eli Manning winning a couple more Super Bowls. So the Giants, when I was growing up, were terrible, which actually opened the door for the Cowboys to become a real fan favorite here on the East Coast. It was amazing. Now, the last guy I just want to talk about, Tarkenton was Hall of Famer, scrambler, probably is snake bit, probably isn't regarded as good a quarterback as he could have been simply because he lost so many Super Bowls. To be fair to him, Tarkington was, they were a good team, Minnesota. They just never were able to, I don't know how to describe it. They always just had a weakness that seemed that the good teams could exploit, whether it was something in their defense, like the Chiefs and the Dolphins, and then the Steelers, and of course the Raiders exposed, or they never had that really a great wide receiver as well. They had Gene Washington in 70, but like I said, had they had somebody like a Lance Retzel or even a Ben Hawkins that you could have sided him with, coupled Gene Washington with, maybe things might have been a little bit different. I will tell you this. I want to find Frank Ryan here before we go on, because I think he's a pretty cool guy. And I will get to Dave Osborne. I think I'll do this in 2 shows because it's been so much fun. But this is Frank Ryan when he played for the LA Rams. And why I always thought Ryan, and I'll continue this next week, I always thought Ryan was pretty funny because he was a transfer student to Rice. Didn't start for the Rice program. They actually had another guy, and I'll get that picture again next week, who looked like a football player and does succeed at TCU, leading him to the Cotton Bowl in 62, I believe. Ryan is drafted, but he wants to be a teacher and a professor and basically a research guy. He matriculated in sciences, math, and specifically physics. Here's the funny thing. He played for the Rams, but gets into basically a fight with Elroy Hirsch about playing time and asks to be traded. And this is a guy who has more smarts in his pinky than most NFL players do in their entire body. He does. Real quick, he gets traded to the Browns and leads them to a championship. I equate him to this. He's kind of like a Tom Brady type player. Maybe not great stats, but could lead a team to victory because of his smarts, and he definitely had smarts. He earned his PhD in physics, and the paper or the study he did, I can't even pronounce. It's like thermonuclear geometric forms and explosions, all this. I will, even next week's show, I'll write that down. But it made me laugh because I can't even pronounce what he has it in. Ryan does lead the Browns to a championship, does retire from football, and does become a physics professor / researcher in the colleges. I think he actually went back to Rice. Anyway, this is the first half of the year they had so many ties, 1967, the NFL and the AFL. This is Will O'Toole. Thank you again for joining me on Park Ridge Sports History. Special shout out to Howard Fredericks, because he always does such a great job producing the show. Thanks and have a great week.